Hi, this is Caroline Monteleone, and you're listening to my friend Matthew Shapiro's podcast, Six Wheels Consulting.
Nice.
Welcome to the Sixth Wheels Consulting Podcast, dialoguing disability and discussing difference, inclusion, and all abilities in today's world. Now here are your hosts, Matthew Shapiro and Bob Nolly.
Hey everyone, welcome back. You have found your way to episode 36 of the Six Wheels Consulting Disability Podcast. Hi, I'm Dr. Bob Nolly, and today we're going to continue a great conversation we started in number 35 with disability lawyer Helen Hardiman. She and Matthew have a great exchange underway talking about not only the legal issues that the disabled may encounter, but actual issues with the laws themselves. And so let's get right back to it. But for folks that are outside of the disability community, you know, other than the things you've discussed, what are the really common barriers that the disabled face when it comes to accessing housing? I mean, what are the problems right now that almost make you thump your forehead and just go, for crying out loud?
And I guess that's from like a broad standpoint, Helen.
Yeah. So again, because reasonable accommodations are sort of the biggest segment of this area of law, the thing that makes me want to pull my hair out is when a client, a person with a disability, will ask for a reasonable accommodation, which is basically, you have this policy, I need a tweak to that policy, or I need you to waive this part of the policy as to me because of my disability, right? And the landlord says, if I do it for you, I have to do it for everyone else. Well, that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what a reasonable accommodation is. The person is not asking you to throw the policy in the trash and let everyone have whatever animals they want. You know, it is keep your policy, but waive it as to me if I can prove that I need this accommodation because of my disability.
Yeah, and I would assume if I can prove that even when you waive this policy, I'm still a good tenant and I follow all the rules and I do all of X, Y, Z.
Exactly. Yes. And that's another, I think, myth is that if you grant a reasonable accommodation to someone, that allows that someone to just do whatever they want in perpetuity. You know, if a landlord accommodates a person with an assistance animal of some sort, even though they have a no pet policy, that doesn't mean that person can let their assistance animal, you know, poop everywhere and bite people and bark at all hours.
Yeah. Right. And that honestly, when you brought up, it's funny because when you brought up the reasonable accommodation, the first thing I thought of was service animals.
Yeah.
That was the first accommodation that came into my mind. But going back to that previous example really quickly, like I said, as somebody who uses one of those metal fold-up ramps, the footprint that ramp leaves is not at all that large of a footprint. It folds up very nicely like a suitcase. You can basically carry it like a suitcase, and your client would have been very easily able to house it in his unit. So the fact that that was a challenge is disheartening for sure.
I know. We'll see how it turns out. I have faith that the Virginia Fair Housing Office will find that this was discrimination and that my client will be made whole.
Sure.
So some other barriers, just quickly, Bob, to your point, that drive me crazy are landlords responding to a request for reasonable accommodations with things like demands for extra money, for extra security deposit, for extra rent. You know, you can't charge someone extra money for an assistive device. Ugh. So when I was at Housing Opportunities Made Equal, we had a case where a retirement home was requiring residents who wanted to live there that used motorized wheelchairs to pay an extra $1,500 security deposit and get a $100,000 liability insurance policy. And it's like, you can't, you know, would you charge someone extra for being a woman, or it's similar, or for having kids because you sort of assume you have these stereotypes that kids are going to tear the place up? I mean, you can't charge someone extra money because of stereotypes you have about them,
right,
when they're in a protected class. And that retirement community ended up having to pay a fair amount of money to all of the people that it had done that to. That wasn't just one person getting their rights violated. They had done this over time.
But again, it also goes back to like, okay, so let's say even if, again, hypothetical, you went out and the elderly folks with the disabilities were in that facility, and they did provide damage to the facility, like, they would be good tenants and they would fix the problem. So I don't know why, like, there's this like fear of like, oh my goodness, if they mess up our unit, they're just going to leave it as is. Like, because I completely agree. If a tenant is bad and like messes things up and then doesn't fix it, then yeah, clearly they're in the wrong there. But I would feel like, and maybe this is my being naive, but I would feel like in most cases, if somebody with a disability was in a unit and they, put a hole in the wall, which is very likely, particularly for me in the way that I drive, but like it's definitely possible that things like that could happen. But if you're a good tenant, you fix those problems.
Right. And you would still be responsible for any damage you cause to the unit, right? Just like anyone else. You don't get off the hook.
Right.
But it's not fair to put a barrier up front for you to enter that unit by charging you an extra $1,500, because I assume, or some retirement communities, I hadn't worked on this case, but I've heard of them around the country. They made people who use motorized wheelchairs take driving tests.
What?
No.
And like be pre-cleared by the nurse. I mean, it's just it's way over the line.
Well, I would fail that test every day.
Don't say that. Don't say that on the record.
I just got.
I'll snip that off. Yeah, no, yeah.
Oh my goodness! Wow, that's crazy. So kind of not in line with that, but because and we've sort of touched on this, but one of the other huge problems is just the lack of accessible housing that's available, right? And you talked about your one client who was like just doing the happy jig because he was actually able to find a unit that was accessible and had all his needs. And I know, we've talked about this on the podcast many times too, that, that's one of the challenges I'm having as somebody who is at some point hoping to get out of my parents' house. And I know my parents are hoping at some point that I get out of my parents' house. There's not a lot of options that is available from a housing standpoint that would have the accommodations I would need, which would be, the biggest one would be a roll-in shower and zero entry into certain places. So why do you think that there is a lack of options?
That is a great question. So that is also a good segue into that third extra protection,
sure,
which is the design and construction requirements of the fair housing laws. And these got added to the Federal Fair Housing Law in 1988 when disability was added. And it says, hey, builders of big apartment complexes, starting in a few years, starting in 1991, if you build brand new multifamily housing, residential housing, you have to have all of your ground floor units meet 7 basic accessibility requirements. Mm-hmm. Matthew, we are not talking about full accessibility. We are not talking about roll-in showers. Right. We are not talking about microwaves where someone could reach. We are not talking about washers and dryers that are, side by side. We are talking about basic adaptable features of multifamily housing. And right. When there's an elevator in the building, all of the units that are reached by that elevator become ground floor units. So you're thinking like, this is pretty good. Like there's 7 requirements that someone could live or visit here with a disability and maybe make some changes as needed to really live there comfortably. But the problem is it's not enforced. It's not the building officials can't even enforce it because it's a civil rights law. A lot of architects don't follow the law. Even when the architects follow the law, the people who build the house deviate from the plan in ways that make it inaccessible. Right. Developers know that they've been getting away with this, since the 90s. And so they don't prioritize it. And so you have big, new, wonderful, beautiful, shiny buildings, some of which have affordable units in them.
Right.
Think about some of the new construction in downtown Richmond. I mean, hundreds of units going up, brand new out of the ground, and they're not even meeting basic accessibility requirements.
Right.
One of the properties in Chaco Valley, it was like a 4-story building, and the hallways to get to the front doors of all the units on the upper floors were so slopey, up and down, not even one way, back and forth. I mean, it felt like you were looking into a funhouse mirror. And no one was going to be able to roll down that hall safely or comfortably.
Right. That just makes me want to bang my head up against the wall, because again, I would argue that housing is probably one of the top 2 or 3 barriers that I hear about and I talk about and I know within the disability community, and that's what prevents people with disabilities from living their most independent lives they possibly can, because there's nowhere for them to go. I mean, that's one of the big factors that we're running into as a family. We've talked about, okay, what's the game plan for when my parents are no longer here? That's going to be a long while from now. But what is the game plan? And there's not a lot of options for me and many people like me to choose from, and that's really disheartening and frustrating.
Which is exactly why these minimal laws that we do have, again, that just cover multifamily new construction, need to be enforced. Now, Matthew, that's still not going to help you with single family homes,
right?
Which in Virginia have, like, I think if anything, they have some door width requirements, but single family homes have no required accessibility features.
Right.
So you're going to have to go find a builder that specializes in universal design or accessibility, and you're going to pay a lot more for that, even though the market is demanding that, and that should be available. The fair housing design and construction requirements don't apply to single family homes. They don't apply to townhouses. So that option is going to be out for you unless you want to pay a bunch of money to retrofit something. It doesn't apply to rehabbed housing. So I mentioned downtown, but all of these warehouses that are being converted, those don't count as new construction for purposes of triggering these requirements. It's only new multifamily construction. So it's a really small segment. And even in that segment, it's not being followed.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the explosion out there in Scott's Addition, where all those old factories that are out in that area there are being converted into apartments and condos. And, that would seem to be an opportunity because of the space involved there, but it may not be happening.
Sure.
Well, if it's not happening under fair housing, I think if some of the lenders, like I know VHDA, for example, the Virginia Housing Development Authority, they really prioritize accessibility. They could, have some mandates for the money. Some building codes will provide for some accessible units, but it's a much smaller percentage. Like Matthew, I think the Virginia statewide building code does require a small portion of the units in multifamily and apartment complexes to be, quote unquote, fully accessible and have roll-in showers. Right. But it's like 2% or something.
I was going to say it's probably like 1 or 2%, which at the end of the day is like maybe 1 and 2 units out of the whole facility.
Exactly.
That's crazy. Interesting. Well, so sort of pivoting away from that, and again thinking these next 2 questions are sort of big picture. What are some things that society could do to help with fair housing and accessible housing on a larger scale? Like what can our listeners do if they get fired up about this fair housing discussion? How can they be of service?
Yeah, well, if they want to kind of join the movement, a great way to do that is by advocating for your friends and family who have disabilities and maybe having trouble in their housing situation. I'm happy to guide them through that if they want some assistance. You mentioned fair housing testing, accessibility testing. So Housing Opportunities Made Equal has a pool of volunteers who sort of secret shop to determine if discrimination is happening. Yes. And that's a really, cool way to be involved part-time, but it's a really integral part of enforcing the law. But I think more broadly, the more that you can do, that we can do individually to change our mindset about not assuming that we know what is best for someone or what a particular disability looks or feels like, and just to let all people, including people with disabilities, tell us what they need and what they prefer. I mean, this is just basic human decency. This is how I'm raising my 6-year-old to treat people, but that would go such a long way in helping open up housing opportunities for everyone.
Sure. And our listeners know that your response you just gave was just like wonderful music to my ears, because that's what we talk about.
I almost want to say thanks for coming to rehearsal. That was spot on right there.
That's right. If you could change one thing about fair housing, either from a fair housing standpoint or specifically from an accessibility standpoint, what would it be?
Yeah, this is a good one. I mean, I think we talked a little bit about expanding the coverage of fair housing laws to include, like, for example, I would include more housing. So I would try to increase the requirement.
Housing, you mean like the type of housing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So like single family homes need to have accessibility requirements, townhouses, rehabs, all of that. And then expanding coverage in terms of broadening the number of protected classes. To include things like sexual orientation and gender identity, because who you love, just like what disability you may or may not have, or your gender, or what country you're from, is totally irrelevant to your ability to qualify for housing and be a good neighbor. Like those two variables are just totally independent. And so because there is, unfortunately, discrimination against people based on their gender identity and sexual orientation, I think we should have explicit protections for those in the act. And then finally, a really important protected class, and Senator Tim Kaine and legislators here in Virginia have tried at the federal and state level to add source of income as a protected class. And there's a disability nexus here as well. So people who are trying to use particular forms of housing assistance, whether it's sort of a standard Section 8 housing choice voucher, or maybe it's rental assistance that's tied to like an IDDD waiver of some sort, or any sort of housing assistance as people with disabilities get integrated into mainstream housing where they should have access. Landlords need to be able to understand that taking those subsidies is just like taking money, and stop stigmatizing how people are paying for their rent. If they can afford it, including with a subsidy, they should have access to that unit.
And so based on what you're saying there, it kind of sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, so right now, they don't necessarily accept those subsidies. And so in most cases, particularly from a disability standpoint, that's how most people are paying for things. And so if they're not accepting it, they're not getting housing. Is that right?
That is right. And we see that all over the state. And I think there is a case to be made under the current law that is discrimination based on disability, but you have to connect a few dots to get there. And so if we just add, tacked on to the list of protected classes in the code, source of income, we could short circuit that case and we would be able to go after those landlords directly.
Sure. This last one's kind of a two-part question, and this is sort of a catch-all for everything. Are there any resources that you'd like to share with our listeners, again, if they're interested in taking up this amazing fight that we've talked about on this wonderful episode? And then is there anything else, in addition to that, is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners? Can they find you on social media, different things like that? Anything you want to plug?
Yeah, so shameless plug for Hardiman Law. I've been open for just over a year.
Congrats.
Thank you.
You're killing it, by the way.
Thank you. I mean, I'm having a great time helping people understand and enforce their rights. So if there are listeners that have questions about housing discrimination, they can find all my contact information on my website. It's hardimanlaw.com. If there are housing providers listening who are worried that they may not be complying with the fair housing law, I can help with that as well. So call me. It's better to ask a question and get something fixed, whether it's, responding to a reasonable accommodation request or revisiting accessibility in your units than to wait until someone gets discriminated against. So a shameless plug for my website. Anything else I want listeners to know? I mean, I can't say enough how important it is to let people choose and qualify for the housing, of their own desires. I think you asked me full circle what kind of got me into fair housing law. When I read the code, I really, I was moved by the values that I saw that animated the Fair Housing Act, because they're values I live by, right? Choice, merit, individualism, fairness. These are like core American values, and that's what fair housing stands for, and that's what I stand for.
Sure.
That's an excellent thought. That's an excellent thought. I'll let that be the parting shot here.
Sure.
Helen, I've got some news for you. Since you've been here with us tonight, you are now promoted to co-host status. So you're welcome back anytime, and you can put your feet up on the table here and tip back a glass with us and talk shop anytime. What you've shared with us tonight has just been so enlightening and motivating, all in the same breath. Thank you very much for being here.
Yes,
oh my gosh.
Great combo.
What a pleasure. I'm blushing. Invitation accepted. I would love to hang out with y'all more.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have been listening to the Six Wheels Consulting Disability Podcast. Our guest tonight has been Helen Hardiman, and you can find her at her website, which is Hardiman Law, HARDIMAN law.com. And you can find Matthew at 6, the number 6, sixwheelsconsulting.com. And folks, remember, think inclusion. Keep rolling forward. Thanks to everyone. Have a good evening. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.